None of us have a crystal ball, so we don't know the scale of impact that these federal government cuts will have. But there are serious concerns about what will happen to some of the medical research projects that have long set the U.S. apart from other countries. Treatment research for things like cancer, Alzheimer's, and diabetes. Here's some of the research universities who have been forced to make cuts. Columbia University. It lost 400 NIH grants. This included a landmark 30-year study on diabetes prevention. Now, that's essentially been dismantled. We also have Johns Hopkins University. They had to lay off 2,200 staffers that they just can't afford anymore. The university put out a statement saying, quote, "We face challenging times for the patients and families that rely on us for cures and treatments." Stanford University, it lost $160 million in NIH funding. That impacted the research they were doing on cancer. And Emory University, they lost $140 million in NIH funding. This impacted their research on vaccines and HIV treatments. So what does this mean for the patients and for the health of our country? I want to bring in Jamie Metzl into this conversation. He is an expert on this intersection of healthcare strategy and geopolitics. He was appointed to the World Health Organization Expert Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing. Jamie, thanks so much for joining us here tonight.
Thanks, Loni. Happy to be here.
All right, let's start with the government cuts to this medical research funding. Explain to us sort of a behind-the-scenes look at just how medical research works, the process, if you will, and what kind of impact this will have on the research itself.
Well, thank you, Loni. So when most of us go to the doctor's office, we get treatments, or maybe our parents or grandparents get cancer and we're really scared and we go to the hospital and there are treatments available. And we don't really think about where all of those treatments come from. But if you were to trace back all of those treatments to their origin, it's basic research that scientists are doing. And then there are clinical trials and all of the work that takes basically an idea into a treatment that can save our lives, our parents' lives, our children's lives, our grandparents' lives. And a huge percentage of this is funded by the federal government because they're really, if you just say, well, companies are going to pay for it, they aren't going to pay for the basic research that feeds everything. And that's what is being cut. And people don't really see it, but we are right now beneficiaries of investments that past generations have made. And we are gutting investments that would have the potential to save so many lives, and not only save lives, but be extremely cost effective. The United States is the leader in genetics, in healthcare, in biotech for a reason, and it's because of the wise investments past generations have made. And so this willy-nilly cutting is just extremely dangerous and harmful.
Well, you know, it's interesting. We're talking about that 30-year-long study. Research takes years to do, right? It's not just a project you can go in and go out. It's things that build throughout the years. And to have these cuts all of a sudden, what does that do to the research?
It wipes it out. The human biology is very complex. If it was just that for every treatment, a bunch of kids needed to go in their garage and mess around for a couple of weeks, and then you get cancer treatments and vaccines and all these things that save so many lives, that would be one thing. But sometimes it can be decades, sometimes even centuries for research to be realized as in life-saving and life-extending even applications. So we already know some of the shorter-term harms to all kinds of vulnerable people, but the longer-term harms are potentially catastrophic. And that doesn't mean that we need to fund everything or that the government needs to keep growing. But if we just randomly cut without having any kind of process, any real rhyme or reason, and ironically, while we're giving massive tax cuts to the wealthiest Americans, I mean, this just seems like a form of self-immolation.
Yeah, let's talk about the patients for a moment. We've got the patients that are being impacted by this, that we're getting the treatments and the research. What happens to them? And also the wider lens pulling back. What about the rest of us, the consequences to the health of our country?
Yeah, so for the patients, if there are patients who are in clinical trials, but maybe these are clinical trials to treat deadly diseases that they have for which there are no other treatments, and these people can just be kicked off of these trials because funding has run out. So certainly there are all of the short-term things that we're seeing, and we're seeing all of the cuts in VA hospitals and other hospitals around the country. But then over the long term, what this means is that treatments that we would otherwise have had, we will very likely not have. I mean, it really just makes no sense to cut like this without any apparent rhyme or reason, with a bunch of young people running wild around Washington, D.C. with no real adult supervision or accountability.
Jamie, I want to ask you another question about sort of a ripple effect here. I want to talk about the scientists, the doctors, the employees that are being laid off because of these cuts and what this is doing to our workforce. You know, some of these researchers are reportedly looking to work in Europe, Australia, Asia, due to this lack of funding. And here's a case in point. France's research minister recently sent a letter to French universities discussing ways to lure researchers from the U.S. So are we heading towards an American brain drain here?
We're already seeing the beginnings of an American brain drain, and that we're already seeing professors, some of our most skilled and talented people, and not just in our healthcare workforce, but in our federal government, who suddenly, for no real reason and for no benefit to our society or economy, have been fired. And all of those people are going to need to find a way to have some other jobs, but there's a very real chance they'll either be leaving the country to do them or doing jobs that won't allow them to contribute to the full extent of their capacities. And the America's workforce, our scientists, our healthcare professionals, our workers, really across the board, it's the most talented workforce in the world. And that doesn't mean that everybody should be guaranteed a lifetime job. But it does mean that if we are trying to make reforms, certainly to government funding and expenditure, that we need to do it with a scalpel, but not a hatchet. And what has happened is we have Elon Musk, and on the spectrum, billionaire South African tech bro, who is willy-nilly firing some of the most talented and skilled Americans, including tens of thousands of patriotic veterans. This is an outrage, and it's a national disgrace.
Yeah. Jamie, I just want to ask you to step back here for a moment and look big picture here. I want you to draw on your vast experience because you've previously served on the U.S. National Security Council, the State Department, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and even as a human rights officer for the United Nations. So you really see this intersection of government funding and medical research more clearly than most. How would you describe the administration's decision to cut this research funding in the way that they've done it?
America is the world leader in science, technology, and healthcare, not by accident, but because generation after generation of Americans have invested in building that future. We are the beneficiaries. That's why our economies are so strong. That's why people come to the United States for healthcare. And what is happening now is not just in healthcare, but really across the board. This administration appears to be taking a hatchet to the foundations of American strength, power, success, and influence. And certainly we're seeing that in healthcare and in the sciences, where the government has a really important role to play in funding basic sciences because there isn't a market for basic sciences. It's too early in the process. And that's really the case across the board. And so I hope that this administration will wake up to the fact that America, it's really a special place. So many generations have built this. And by all means, we need accountability, we need transparency. Government can't grow forever. But if all we're going to do is have a bunch of 19-year-old tech bros making huge decisions with monumental implications for our society, that's really going to put us in an even worse place.
All right, Jamie, last question for you. I know you also have a PhD from Oxford in history. And I think that analyzing what is happening in our country right now through a historical perspective can be very enlightening. How do you see all of this playing out?
It's really unfortunate. I mean, the United States wasn't a big player on the world stage until World War I, and we were hesitant to get into World War I. And then we entered because we realized that we couldn't stay on the sidelines. And then after World War I, we had a moment kind of like now, where there were people like Charles Lindbergh, there was an America First moment where they said we should just worry about ourselves and not worry about the rest of the world. And we tried that, and it turned out, certainly after we helped sink the League of Nations, that wasn't possible. That without American leadership, the world was falling into this horrible black hole. And that was why, under President Roosevelt and others, we stepped forward, not just to save the world from Nazism and Japanese imperialism, but then to lay a foundation for a world where we could all come together. And that's why these last 80 years have been among the most productive and helpful for humanity in all of human history. And now it appears that our administration is taking a hatchet to that. And that's really dangerous, because not everybody recognizes the central role the United States government plays in so many different things, in peace and security around the world, in health and healthcare, in industry, in trade. And if we just pull out that support, we could go back to what I think has been the state of nature for the world for much of human history, which is war. There is no inherent reason why Kyiv in Ukraine is getting bombed and Paris isn't. If we are not careful, the world is going to start looking like it used to look before the United States and others laid a foundation for this incredible period of peace, security, stability, and economic growth.
Jamie Metzl, really appreciate your context and perspective on this really important issue.